The first thing my son heard that evening wasn't my voice. It was the news anchor saying my name. Authorities say retired Portland engineer Gerald Callahan saved at least 6 people after rushing into a chain reaction crash outside Portland International Airport. Witnesses say he ignored repeated warnings and climbed into burning vehicles while waiting for firefighters to arrive. My son dropped his phone. My daughter stopped chewing halfway through dinner. And just 2 hours earlier, they had both told me to take an Uber. The name's Gerald Callahan, 68 years old, a retired civil engineer out of Portland, Oregon. I've never been one for the spotlight. Welcome back to Dad's Revenge. I'm glad you found your way here today. Before we get into the story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Is this your first time sitting with me here? Or have you been along for the ride for a while? Either way, you're welcome. One small note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the truth underneath it. For 42 years, my wife Helen took care of birthdays, holidays, neighborhood get-togethers, and family dinners. Me, I was happiest fixing a leaky faucet, building a bookshelf for the grandkids, or grilling salmon on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Helen always said I was the kind of man people could count on, because I never complained. Maybe she was right. Or maybe I just never wanted the people I loved carrying the weight of my troubles. That habit would end up being my greatest mistake. 3 days before everything fell apart, I stood next to my wife's casket in Victoria. Helen had spent the last several months there with her younger sister, after her cancer turned more aggressive. The treatments available in Canada offered one final possibility, and her sister had insisted on caring for her day and night. I made the trip back and forth as often as I was able. Every visit grew harder to leave. Every goodbye stretched longer than the one before. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, there were no more goodbyes, just silence. The funeral was small, exactly the way Helen had wanted it. No expensive flowers, no dramatic speeches, just family, a handful of lifelong friends, and the soft music she loved. After everyone had gone, I stayed beside her grave until the cemetery groundskeeper gently let me know they were closing up. "You can come back tomorrow," he said quietly. I managed a small smile. I know, but tomorrow already felt like another lifetime. The following morning, I boarded a short flight back to Portland. I carried one worn duffel bag. My wedding ring still sat on my finger. Taking it off was something I couldn't bring myself to consider. For most of the flight, I kept my eyes fixed on the window. Clouds drifted below us like fresh snow. Helen used to reach across the armrest whenever we flew. She always hated turbulence. She'd squeeze my hand and murmur, "If we make it through this flight, you're buying me fish and chips." I always laughed. Now the empty seat beside me ached in a way words couldn't touch. The plane set down at Portland International Airport a few minutes before 5. While passengers rose to pull down their bags, I stayed in my seat. There was no reason to rush. Nobody was waiting for me. Even so, I opened the family group chat. It included me, my son Colin, my daughter Renee, Colin's wife Suzanne, and a few family members who mostly shared birthday pictures and holiday plans. I typed, "My flight lands at 5:00 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" I looked at the screen for nearly a minute before pressing send. Part of me nearly deleted it. I've never liked asking anyone for favors, especially my own children. The message showed as delivered. A minute later, Colin replied, "We're busy. Take an Uber." Then, Renee, "How was the funeral? Are you okay?" Just 6 words. Before I had time to sit with them, another notification came through. "Renee, Dad, you should have planned better." I stared at those words far longer than I should have. Planned better. As if grief could be penciled in between soccer practice and business meetings. As if losing the woman I'd loved since I was 24 should have slotted neatly into everyone else's schedule. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could have reminded them where I'd just been. I could have pointed out that their mother had been in the ground less than 24 hours. I could have told them how much I'd needed to see familiar faces instead of getting into yet another stranger's car. But I wrote only 2 words. "No worries." I hit send. Then I slid my phone into my jacket pocket. Not because things were fine, but because something had quietly become clear to me. You can't make people care. Outside the terminal, Portland met me with gray skies and cool air. A light drizzle slicked the sidewalks. Travelers moved briskly toward waiting cars. Families embraced. Children laughed. Horns sounded. Life went on exactly as it always had. Only mine had changed forever. I wheeled my bag toward the rideshare pickup area. My knees ached not from age, from exhaustion. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in weeks. While I stood waiting, I spotted an elderly woman struggling to lift her suitcase off the curb. Without a second thought, I walked over. "Need a hand?" She looked up with visible relief. "Would you?" I hoisted it into the trunk of her son's SUV. "Thank you," she said. "I hope someone does the same for you someday." I smiled back. "I hope so too." Then a sound like a cannon shot cut through everything. Metal against metal, glass exploding, people screaming. Every head turned toward the airport exit road. A fuel delivery truck had jackknifed after a speeding SUV struck it. Several vehicles piled up behind it. Smoke rolled into the evening sky. One sedan spun sideways and slammed into the concrete barrier. Another vehicle caught fire. People froze. Some raised their phones. Others took steps back. Years earlier, before I retired, I had volunteered with emergency preparedness programs, earthquake drills, industrial accident training. Instinct moved before fear had any chance to. I dropped my bag. Someone grabbed my arm. "Sir, don't go over there." I pulled free. "Call 911. They already did. Good. I ran. The driver's door of the burning sedan wouldn't budge. A young mother inside was hammering against the window with both fists. A little girl was crying in the back seat. The smell of gasoline was everywhere. Someone hollered, "It's going to explode." Maybe, maybe not. Either way, those people couldn't wait. I grabbed a chunk of broken concrete from the roadside. With everything I had left, I swung it into the side window. Once, twice, 3 times. The glass gave way. "Cover your face!" I shouted. The mother curled herself over the little girl as I knocked away the remaining shards. Behind me, sirens wailed in the distance, still far away. Far too far. And the only thing running through my mind was simple. Helen would never forgive me if I stood there and watched someone else lose the person they loved. The first officer who reached me grabbed my shoulder and shouted above the chaos, "Sir, step back. We need you behind the barricade." "I can't," I said, pointing toward an overturned SUV. "There's still someone inside." He looked where I was pointing. A hand was pressed flat against the cracked windshield. He didn't hesitate. "You!" he called to 2 firefighters sprinting toward us. "Help him!" It was only then that I noticed how badly my hands were shaking. The adrenaline had drowned out everything else. Now I could feel the cuts across both palms from the broken glass. My right sleeve had been scorched where flames had caught the doorframe. My knees ached from kneeling on broken asphalt, but none of that mattered. The firefighters worked the SUV open while paramedics rushed toward the sedan I'd helped clear. Somewhere behind me, a voice called out, "The little girl is breathing." I shut my eyes for one brief second. Thank you, Helen. Nearly 45 minutes later, the scene was finally under control. Emergency vehicles ringed the entire airport entrance. Traffic backed up for miles. A police officer came over with a clipboard. "Sir, your name?" "Gerald Callahan." "Age?" 68. He studied me for a moment. "You should probably be in one of those ambulances." "I've had worse." He almost smiled. "My wife says every man over 60 says exactly that." The word wife landed like a second collision. I gave a quiet nod. "I just buried mine yesterday." His expression changed. I'm sorry." "So am I." He lowered the clipboard. "I'll keep this brief." Over the next 20 minutes, I answered his questions. Which vehicle had I reached first? How many passengers had I helped out? Had I seen what caused the crash? Several witnesses kept cutting in. "No, officer," one woman insisted. "He's leaving things out." "What do you mean?" He went back. Another man stepped forward. 3 different times. A young college student added. Everyone else was standing there filming. He kept running back in. I shook my head. "There were firefighters there." "Not at first," the student said. "They got there because you bought everyone time." I didn't have anything to say to that. I hadn't been keeping track. I'd simply seen people who needed help. Eventually, a paramedic persuaded me to sit on the back step of an ambulance while she cleaned up my hands. She looked about my granddaughter's age. "Does someone need to come get you?" I almost laughed. "No, I'm sure." She wrapped fresh bandages around both palms. "You've got family nearby." "I do." "Have they been notified?" "They're busy." She held my gaze for a moment, too professional to push further. Instead, she handed me the bottle of water. "I hope someone gives you a ride home." "So do I." A television reporter made her way toward me with a cameraman. "Mr. Callahan." "Yes." I'm Audra Fleming. Would you mind answering a few questions? I really don't think so. You've become the central witness to all of this. I'm not interested. What if people want to thank you? They don't need to. The cameraman lowered his equipment. Audra softened her voice. We've spoken to firefighters. They said several people would likely have died if you hadn't acted. I looked out toward the flashing emergency lights. I'm glad they're alive. That's all you want to say? Yes. She nodded. Fair enough. She didn't push. I was grateful for that. Helen had a deep respect for people who understood that no was its own complete answer. The roads around the airport were hopelessly snarled, so one of the officers offered to drive me to a hotel nearby where other stranded passengers had been taken. He wasn't giving me much choice. You can't be out wandering on your own tonight. My house is just a few miles from here. Roads are all blocked anyway. He had a point. I ended up in a modest room, less than 10 minutes from the terminal. Quiet, unremarkable cream-colored walls, a wall-mounted television, and a window overlooking the courtyard. The noise of the day finally fell away. I lifted Helen's small travel bag onto the dresser. Tucked inside was the gray cardigan she'd insisted on packing, even though she never wore it. The fabric still held the faintest trace of her perfume. I sat on the edge of the mattress with it in my hands. That was when the tears came. Not from the pain in my palms, not from the crash, but from the knowledge that no message would ever arrive from Helen again, checking to make sure I'd touched down safely. My children, meanwhile, had no idea what had happened. Colin had wrapped up dinner with Suzanne and their teenage son. Renee was at the kitchen table helping her youngest with a science project. Neither of them had glanced at a screen all evening. Colin checked the family group chat at some point. My last message was still, no worries, nothing after. Suzanne noticed his expression. Did your father get home all right? He would have caught a ride. You could have gone to get him. A small sigh. I had a client dinner. Suzanne let it go. She didn't say another word about it, but the look she held a moment longer than necessary said plenty. Then, roughly an hour later, Colin's phone lit up in quick succession. A neighbor, a buddy from college, someone he'd once worked with, and finally his boss. Colin. Yeah. I'm watching something on TV right now. Gerald Callahan, that's your father. Colin's brow pulled together. What about him? Switch on Channel 5, right now. Why, what's going on? The call ended without an answer. Colin grabbed the remote. Every local station had the same story. Aerial camera footage, smoke-twisted metal emergency vehicles converging. Then the shot tightened on a single figure. A gray-haired man in a dark jacket forcing his way through the broken window of a car that was still burning. Colin went rigid. No. Suzanne's voice dropped to a whisper. The anchor's voice filled the room. Authorities confirmed that retired Portland resident Gerald Callahan entered active crash zones multiple times before emergency crews had established a perimeter. Then they cut to me outside an ambulance, one sleeve darkened with blood. The reporter kept talking. Bystanders had said Callahan showed no sign of panic the entire time. Suzanne reached for Colin's arm. Wasn't that? He couldn't find his voice. Something had seized up in his chest. On the other side of the city, Renee's phone rang at almost the same moment. Her friend Lorraine didn't bother with small talk. Every station in Portland is showing your dad right now. Renee let out a nervous half laugh. That can't be right. I'm telling you, turn on your TV. She did. Her hand flew to her mouth within seconds. The clip ran on a loop. Then the broadcast cut to a screenshot, an image pulled from the family group chat, part of a timeline that investigators had reconstructed through airport security records. According to the anchor, Mr. Callahan had flown in from Canada just that evening, returning from his wife's funeral. Renee felt something drop inside her. Her mother. She'd been buried in her own routine work, the kids, the noise of daily life. And it hadn't once crossed Renee's mind to picture what that flight home alone must have been like for him. A second image appeared. Me moving through the terminal on my own, one worn duffel bag at my side, not a single familiar face waiting. Renee breathed it out quietly. Oh, Dad. My phone sat untouched on the nightstand, face down. No calls answered, no messages read, no awareness of the wave of notifications piling up while I lay there. After years of being the one everyone forgot to check on, I had suddenly become the person everyone was trying to reach. I came awake just before 6 the following morning. There were a few seconds of blankness, almost peace. I didn't know where I was. Helen wasn't gone yet. The airport hadn't happened. Then my arm drifted across to the other side of the bed. Cold sheets, nothing else. Everything rushed back. I stayed there in the quiet for a long while, watching pale light slowly climb the Portland sky outside the window. I left the television off. Seeing my own face on the news held zero appeal. 40 years of fixing things in the background had shaped me that way. The work was the point, never the credit. Helen used to say I'd pull an entire block back from the edge of disaster and then disappear before the dust settled. You'd rescue the whole neighborhood, she always told me, then sneak away before anyone could thank you. She knew me better than I knew myself. The phone kept vibrating. Eventually I picked it up. 43 missed calls, dozens of messages. Colin, Renee, Suzanne, old neighbors, former co-workers, and people whose names I barely recognized anymore. Colin's first message, "Dad, where are you?" His second, "Please call me, I'm sorry." Renee's read much the same way. "Dad, please pick up. We're scared. Don't be by yourself right now." I sat with the phone in my hand and didn't write back. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about making them feel guilty. I just had nothing in me for a conversation yet. Some kinds of grief seal you off completely. This was that kind. Close to 8 Zora, someone knocked. I opened the door to find Audra Fleming, the reporter from the night before. She looked like she half expected to be turned away. "I'm sorry to be here. How'd you track me down?" "The officer didn't give us anything. The hotel manager put it together from the morning broadcast." "Ah, I'm not here with a camera. I'm not going to ask you to go on record." Something in her tone made me believe it. "Then what brings you—" She paused before answering. "The hospital reached out. They asked me to find you." "The hospital. The little girl, the one from the sedan." My stomach clenched. "Is she—" Audra's face softened. "She's fine. She's going to be okay." My eyes shut for a moment. "Thank God." "Her folks wanted you to hear it from someone. She's been asking about the man who smashed the window." Something between a laugh and a breath escaped me. "I hope they've explained to her why you don't usually go through windows." Audra smiled at that. "They'd also love for you to visit when you're ready." "I'll think about it." She turned to go, then stopped. "There are around 20 reporters camped outside." I exhaled slowly. "I figured as much. They have no idea you're in here. Let's make sure it stays that way." "Absolutely." She left. It was the first point in all of this where I felt the world still had some room for reporters who knew when to put the notepad down. Colin, meanwhile, had been awake all night. So had Renee. By 7 that morning, they were both standing outside my front door, the house they had grown up in, the one Helen had made into a home. Colin used the spare key I'd left with him years ago to let them in. Nothing had moved. Helen's rocking chair sat angled toward the front window, just as she'd always kept it. My work boots were lined up by the garage. But the kitchen was wrong. That particular smell of a fresh pot of coffee that had greeted every morning for more than 40 years was simply absent. Helen had always beaten me out of bed. The room felt emptied out in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. Renee drifted into the dining room. The small vase was still on the table. Inside it were dried rosemary sprigs. "Our anniversary," she said softly. Colin glanced up. "What do you mean? Mom always puts something there before their anniversary." A silence settled between them, heavy and unmoving. "We should get things tidied up before Dad's back," Renee said at last. Colin agreed. It gave their hands something to do. While Renee worked through the living room bookshelves, she noticed an old cedar chest wedged beneath the staircase. Her brow creased. "I've never come across this before." Colin came to look. "It's Mom's." The lid lifted without resistance. Inside photo albums, bundles of letters, and 6 leather-bound journals. Helen's handwriting marked a year on the front of each one. Renee lifted the most recent with care. "I don't think we should open it." Colin turned away slightly. "I think she'd have wanted us to." He wasn't sure of that. Neither was Renee, but she opened it anyway. The early pages were gentle meals around the table, trips they had planned, ordinary milestones. Then something shifted. One entry, and both of them went still. "Gerald sold his fishing boat today. Colin still thinks we have it. I begged Gerald not to say a word about why. Every cent went toward the down payment on Colin's first house. He'd never have let us do it if he'd known." Colin's color drained. "No." Renee turned the page. Renee's divorce lawyer needed another payment. Gerald pulled the money quietly from our retirement savings. He told the kids afterward that we'd been thinking about a smaller place for a while. Sometimes love wears the face of a joke, so a sacrifice can pass unnoticed. Renee pressed her hand to her mouth. "I actually believe that." I thought they genuinely wanted to downsize. Colin lowered himself into a chair. I did too. They read on. Journal after journal, year after year. Each one gave up another secret. Gerald had gone back to work as a consultant after retiring, not for the mental exercise, but because Colin's business had come within reach of collapsing. He'd kept driving that old truck past the point. It made sense because Renee's eldest needed braces. He'd canceled trip after trip because the tuition bills kept arriving, and not a word of complaint, not once. What comes next stopped me cold the first time I sat with it, because sometimes what you think you know about the people closest to you turns out to be only the surface. What they find changes everything, so I have to ask if someone you loved had been quietly carrying a weight for years without ever telling you, would you want to know, or would part of you wish you hadn't found out? Not once had he asked for any of it back. Then Renee found an entry written only 4 months before. She read it aloud, her voice breaking. The doctors in Victoria believe one more treatment is worth pursuing. Gerald insisted we try. He withdrew nearly everything remaining in our retirement savings today. He was smiling when he signed the papers, but I know the weight of what that cost him. If I don't make it through this, I pray the children never confuse his silence for not caring. Behind that quietness lives the largest heart I have ever known. Colin leaned forward, both elbows on his knees. His shoulders started to shake. His voice gave out. I thought Dad was just careful with money. Renee dragged the back of her hand across her cheek. So did I. Neither of them had ever stopped to wonder why I kept driving a 12-year-old pickup, or why the same winter coat hung on the hook every year, or why I always said I was doing just fine. They had taken it at face value because taking things at face value is so much easier than asking questions. Around noon, Suzanne showed up with sandwiches. She took one look at the two of them and knew something had shifted. What's going on? Colin passed her one of Helen's journals. She read 3 pages. Then she settled quietly beside her husband. I'm so sorry. Colin kept his eyes on the floor. I told him to take an Uber. Suzanne found his hand. I know. My mother had just been buried. I know. I never even asked if he was all right. Suzanne held his hand tighter. What matters now is what you do from here. Colin lifted his gaze toward the front door. I don't even know where he is. Across the city, I was sitting by myself on a bench above the Willamette River. The breeze off the water carried a cool, damp smell. Helen had loved this spot. She used to say the ferries reminded her that life was always carrying someone home. I smiled at that, even though it hurt. Then my phone rang. This time I picked up. Hello? A long stretch of silence. Then Colin's voice came through unsteady. 4 words. Dad, come home. Those 4 words stayed in my chest long after the call was over. Dad, come home. Simple as that. The words I had needed to hear 24 hours earlier arriving now just a beat too late. I hadn't slammed the phone down, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't even asked what had changed. I told him, I'm not ready yet, and I ended the call, not to make him hurt, to give myself room to breathe. There are times when even the possibility of forgiveness needs space before it can take hold. I spent the rest of the afternoon moving along Portland's waterfront. The ferries crossed the Willamette River, steadily full of commuters living out an ordinary weekday. People rushed to appointments. Tourists raised their cameras. Somebody was playing guitar near the Portland Saturday market. The world doesn't hold still for a family coming apart at the seams. Helen knew that as well as anyone. During the hard stretches, she would take my hand and say, "The world keeps turning, Gerald. We have to decide whether we'll keep walking with it." Standing there that afternoon, I wasn't sure I still knew how. Portland was full of her. The bakery where she always had to have the cinnamon rolls. The bookstore where she'd vanish for an hour and resurface carrying 3 novels she swore she didn't need. The little waterfront seafood place where we'd marked our 40th anniversary. Every one of those memories was beautiful. Every one of them stung. My phone went off again. Not Colin this time. It was Audra Fleming. I answered. Yes. I thought we'd agreed no interviews. We did. Then why are you calling? A beat of silence. Because this isn't a call for television. I waited. The mayor's office wants to present you with an award. I'm not interested. That's what I figured. The governor's office has also been in touch. No. The fire department. No. The hospital. I already heard the little girl is all right. She is. Another pause. There's one more thing. Go ahead. I'd like to tell the story the right way. I found myself almost smiling. The right way. Every station out there is calling you a hero. I don't feel like one. I know that. Then why would an interview help? Because people are filling in the blanks themselves. I let that sit. They're spinning stories about why you were at the airport alone. That's not their business. I think it might be. Why? Because there are a lot of people out there who understand loneliness. That answer stopped me. She kept going, her voice quieter. My father died alone in a nursing home during COVID. I never got to say goodbye. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry. I've spent 4 years wishing I could have had one more conversation with him. Neither of us said anything for a moment. At last she asked, would you consider sitting down with me, just once? No political angle. Never. No swelling background music. She gave a small laugh. I promise. And nothing that goes after my children. I wouldn't allow that. I thought about Helen. She believed stories could do some good in the world when told honestly. One interview. Thank you. One condition. Name it. If I decide not to answer something, we move on. Agreed. The interview was recorded the next morning in a quiet conference room at OHSU Hospital. No crowd, no studio lighting, just 2 chairs. A small camera, Audra and me. Before they rolled, she looked over and asked if I was nervous. A little. So am I, she said. That made me laugh. Good. The producer counted down. 3, 2, 1. The camera light went red. Audra started. Mr. Callahan, millions of people have now watched what happened at the airport. I've been told. They're calling you brave. I think the firefighters were the brave ones. Witnesses say you ran toward the danger while everyone else stepped back. I saw people who needed help. Were you afraid? I looked down at my bandaged palms. Of course. Then why did you keep going back? I thought about Helen, 42 years of mornings, of hospitals, of sitting beside her in dimly lit rooms, holding her hand while she slept through the night. When you've spent 42 years loving one person, my voice caught. Fear stops mattering as much. Audra held the silence. You spend enough time watching someone fight to stay alive. I had to swallow before continuing. And you stop thinking about whether something is dangerous. You start thinking about whether someone needs you. The room went very still. Even the cameraman looked at the floor. Audra moved gently to the next question. We understand you had just come back from Canada. That's right. You were returning from your wife's funeral. Yes. I'm sorry. Thank you. She paused, then asked the question that would echo far beyond that room. Did your family know you were on your way home? I understood exactly what was beneath that question. Millions of people watching would want to know the answer. I could have laid it all out, every text, every word, the whole quiet sequence of events. I could have let the country decide what my children deserved. Instead, I said, they have busy lives. Audra waited, I went on. They're raising families, they're working hard, they're juggling more at their age than I ever had to. So they couldn't come to the airport. I gave a small shrug. Life gets complicated. She studied me for a long moment. You don't sound like someone who's angry. I've already had enough grief this week. There wasn't room to carry anger alongside it. The interview wrapped up shortly after. Audra stood and put her arms around me briefly. I hope my dad would have answered the way you did. I hope he would have had the chance. She turned away blinking and walked toward the control room. By noon, the interview was running across Oregon, then Washington, then California. By evening, it was spreading everywhere. Not because of what I'd done at the airport, but because of 5 words. They have busy lives. The reaction was immediate and massive. People wrote that those 5 words landed harder than any direct accusation could have. One woman posted that her father said the same thing every time she forgot to call. A man wrote that he'd just bought a plane ticket to see his parents. A retired Marine left a comment, "The strongest men are often the quietest." Colin watched it by himself in his office. When he saw me smile and speak on his behalf, he pressed his face into his hands. I don't deserve that, he said quietly. Renee was on her couch when it aired. Her youngest daughter crawled up beside her. Why is Grandpa saying nice things about people who hurt his feelings? Renee had no answer for that. Her daughter tilted her head, puzzled. If somebody hurt my feelings, I don't think I'd protect them. Renee cried harder. Most adults wouldn't. That was exactly what made it so difficult to watch. That evening, my porch filled up without anyone being asked. Neighbors brought flowers and handwritten notes. A few veterans set small American flags along the front walkway. The family across the way mowed the lawn without a word to anyone. Someone hauled in fresh mulch and worked it into Helen's flower beds. Not one person rang the bell. They just came and did what needed doing. Old Mr. Kowalski told a news crew from across the street, "Gerald's been looking after this neighborhood for 30 years." The reporter asked what he meant. After windstorms, he'd fix people's roofs. Snowstorms, he'd check on the widows. Never took a cent from anybody. Did people know he was doing it? Mr. Kowalski's expression was almost sad. Gerald wasn't the kind of man who made a point of his kindness. Late that night, I finally pulled into the driveway. Everything looked the same as I'd left it, except for the front porch. 2 lawn chairs sat out there. Colin was in one. Renee was in the other. Neither of them had a phone in hand. Neither said a word when I climbed out of the truck. They just rose to their feet. For the first time in longer than I could remember, neither of them had somewhere else to be. None of us moved for several seconds. Colin on the left, Renee on the right. The porch light threw long shadows across the yard, making them seem younger somehow. Not because anything had shifted overnight, but because for the first time in years, I could read uncertainty on their faces. Most of a parent's life is spent watching that look disappear from their children. You teach them to ride a bike, get behind a wheel, balance a budget, make their own calls. Then one day they're capable and confident, and you find yourself quietly hoping they still know how to need you. My worn duffel bag sat in the truck bed. Colin was at my side before I reached for it. "Dad, I've got that." I looked at him. Part of me wanted to say no. Instead, I let him take it. He brought it inside without another word. That simple thing stopped me. Last time that boy had carried anything of mine, he was probably 12 years old. Renee came toward me slowly, almost cautiously, as if moving too fast might cause me to vanish. "I made coffee," I managed a faint smile. "Your mother's recipe," she nodded. "Found it in her cookbook." "Does it taste right?" She laughed through tears. "Not even close." That pulled a smile from both of us. It was the first honest smile I'd had since Helen died. The house felt familiar again. Flowers from neighbors blanketed nearly every surface, cards, letters, homemade cookies. A handmade quilt from the church Helen had attended for years was folded over a chair. I looked around without speaking. "You've been cleaning." Renee lowered her eyes. "We wanted the house ready when you got back." "It shows." Colin swallowed. "We also found Mom's journals." My gaze moved toward the dining room. I'd been expecting that moment. "You knew." "Of course." "You let us read them." "Those pages were hers." He nodded slowly. "We had no idea." "I know." "No, Dad." His voice broke. "I mean, we truly had no idea." I understood exactly what he meant. We gathered around the dining room table, the same one where Helen had put out Thanksgiving dinner for 4 decades. No television, no phones, 3 cups of coffee. Renee reached into her bag and set one of Helen's journals on the table. I read every word. "So did I," Colin said quietly. Neither raised their eyes to mine. Colin broke the silence first. "I always thought you kept working because you wanted to. Staying busy suits me. But that wasn't the real reason. No, I was paying your mortgage. You were struggling. You sold the boat to cover it. It was just a boat." "That was Grandpa's boat." I smiled. "I still carry the memories." Colin shook his head. "I'd never have taken the money if I'd known." "That's why?" "So why keep it from me?" "Because I didn't want the help turning into a weight on your shoulders." Silence moved through the room. Renee dabbed at a tear. "I thought you were ready to simplify. Your mother wanted to protect your dignity after the divorce. I'd have found another way." "You found one because she did." I nodded. Renee covered her face. "I keep going back to that text." I said nothing. "Dad, you should have planned better." Her shoulders began to shake. "I actually typed that." "You did." "I'd give anything to undo it." I reached across and placed my hand over hers. "You can't." She looked up at me. "But you choose who you are from here on out." Colin got up and drifted to the kitchen window. He stood there a good while staring at the backyard. "Something's been bothering me." "What?" "That reporter when he asked if we even knew you were headed home." "Go on." "You had every reason to destroy us." The full story was mine to tell. "You could have." "So what held you back?" Helen came to mind the way she always did. Every answer still found its way back to her. Shaming someone publicly doesn't close a private wound. No one spoke. I kept going. "If the whole country had turned on, you would Mom have wanted that." Colin shook his head slowly. "No, no. Helen believed in leading people somewhere, not just tearing them down and walking away." Renee asked quietly, "Were you angry?" I laughed softly. "Of course I was. You didn't show it. I've had practice." She frowned. "Practice after being married 42 years. You learn," I said, "that anything you say in anger just hands you another mess by morning." Colin smiled at that. "Mom always said you'd disappear into the garage when something got to you." "I sorted screws." Renee stared at me. "What?" "The coffee cans. Quarter-inch, half-inch, three-quarter-inch." Colin's face broke into a grin. "You weren't actually sorting." "No." "Then what were you doing, waiting until I could speak without making things worse?" Quiet settled in again. Renee said softly, "I wish I'd figured that out sooner." "It's not too late." A few days on, the three of us drove to the cemetery together. Helen's ashes rested in the memorial garden overlooking the Columbia River, exactly where she'd asked to be. We stood holding fresh yellow roses. Colin spoke first. "I'm sorry, Mom." Renee nodded beside him. "I didn't realize how much you were both carrying." A light wind moved through the trees above us. I half expected Helen to remind us we were bunched too close. She had a standing joke that everyone needed to spread out in family photos. But there was no voice, only stillness. A peaceful kind, not hollow, just layered with everything we'd shared. Colin turned to me. "I assumed you'd always be there." "I hoped I would. I never thought about what it'd look like if you were the one who needed us." I set the flowers at Helen's marker. Parents spend most of their years teaching children how to stand on their own. I looked at both of them. The hardest part is teaching them to find their way back. Colin fell apart. He got both arms around me and held on. Nothing like the stiff, brief embrace grown sons usually manage. This was raw. A son who had only just understood how close he'd come to losing the man who had quietly kept his world from unraveling. Renee stepped in and held us both. The three of us stood beneath the tall evergreens crying, while afternoon sun pushed through the clouds. It was the first time since Helen's funeral that the loneliness had loosened its grip. That evening, Colin surprised me. He canceled a business trip. Renee rearranged her schedule. Neither said a word about it. Neither waited for thanks. They just stayed. We ordered pizza played cards the way Helen had always loved. The grandkids raced through the backyard until the light gave out. I watched from the porch. Colin settled in beside me. "Dad." "Yeah." "I can't undo the message I sent." "No. But I can make sure you never read anything like it from me again." I looked at my son, then out at my daughter on the lawn, with her children tumbling around her. People picture revenge as settling a score the moment the scales finally balance. What I understood sitting there was quieter than that. The real answer to being forgotten wasn't payback. It was watching the people who'd stopped seeing your value begin to see it again while there was still time. And that was already underway. Healing isn't a single moment. People expect it to arrive all at once. It doesn't. It shows up in ordinary days one at a time. A week after Helen's memorial service, I woke before sunrise, same as I had, nearly all my adult life. My hand moved toward her side of the bed out of habit, still empty. Some things in us don't get word when someone's gone. Rather than let the quiet press down, I dressed, made coffee, and went out to the back porch. The garden caught the early light softly. Helen's roses had opened up. She was always clear she couldn't take credit. "They don't bloom because of my gardening," she'd say. "They bloom because someone takes the time to notice them." Standing there, I thought maybe that was true of people too. At exactly 8 hours, a truck turned into the drive. Colin, not because anything was broken, not because he needed something. He came up onto the porch carrying 2 mugs. "I figured yours would be cold by now," he said. I laughed. "You figured right." He sat down and we let the silence be. We watched birds moving across the lawn for several minutes. Then he said, "I canceled my Wednesday morning meetings." "You didn't need to." "I know. I wanted to." 4 words that landed heavier than he probably knew. Young children get their parents' time by necessity. Grown ones have to choose to give theirs. Colin was starting to make that choice. Renee changed too. Thursday evenings she'd come by after work. Sometimes groceries, sometimes a pot of soup that was good, just never quite Helen's. She'd say so herself. "I cannot get your wife's chicken noodle soup right." "Nobody can?" "I even used the recipe." I smiled. "Your mother always left one thing out." "What? Patience?" Renee laughed. "That's not an ingredient. It was for her." Those Thursday evenings became something we all counted on. No milestone, no occasion, just family around a table the way it never should have stopped. The grandchildren noticed the change before any of us did. One Saturday afternoon, my oldest grandson Gavin wandered into the garage on his own. He looked along the shelves, taking in all the tools. "Dad says you built almost everything in this house." "Most of it." "Can you teach me 3 words?" And they filled something in me I hadn't even known had gone hollow. For the next few hours, we worked shoulder to shoulder, putting together a simple wooden toolbox. Gavin measured twice, cut once, missed. A nail laughed at himself and tried again. By the time the sun dropped low, the toolbox sat with a noticeable tilt to one side. "It isn't perfect," Gavin said. I laid my hand on his shoulder. "Neither are families." He looked up at me. "But if the foundation is strong," I tapped the little wooden box, "it'll still stand." He smiled. Something told me he'd carry that conversation with him long after he'd forgotten how lopsided the toolbox had been. A month later, the Portland Fire Department asked me to speak at a community emergency preparedness program. I nearly said no. Standing up in front of a crowd had never come easily to me. Then something Helen used to say came back to me. If your experience can help someone else, it's no longer just your story. So I said, yes. The room held retirees, young parents, college students, and first responders. When my turn came, I didn't dwell on the airport accident. Instead, I talked about preparation, about keeping your head, about learning basic first aid, about watching out for your neighbors. Then, near the end, a man in the audience raised his hand. "What made you run toward those cars?" The room went still. I thought carefully before I answered. My wife spent 2 years teaching me something. What was that? She taught me that every extra minute matters. I paused. When someone you love is fighting for their life, you stop wasting time telling yourself someone else will handle it. The audience sat in silence for several seconds. Then they stood. Not because of anything I'd done, because they understood. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Colin started bringing his family over every Sunday afternoon. Renee stopped calling only when she needed a favor. Instead, she'd ring just to ask, "What are you up to?" Sometimes the answer was watching baseball, other times mending the fence or just sitting with thoughts of her mother. Those calls grew longer, warmer, more real. One evening, Colin surprised me again. He held out a small envelope. Inside was a receipt. "The retirement account," he said. I looked up. "What about it? I'm paying back every dollar you put in to help me." I pushed the envelope gently back toward him. "You don't owe me a thing." "I do." "No, I want to." I smiled. "Then spend it on your children." He frowned. "What?" "Take them camping, travel somewhere together, build memories. That's worth a great deal more than paying me back." His eyes filled with tears. "You're really not going to let me repay you, are you?" "I already got paid." "How you came back?" A few months after that, on what would have been Helen's 66th birthday, the whole family came together in the backyard. The grandchildren darted between the rose bushes. Renee gave her best effort at Helen's peach cobbler. It still wasn't quite the same. We laughed about it anyway. Colin grilled salmon exactly the way I'd shown him years before. As the sun eased down, everyone quieted. Colin rose and lifted a glass of lemonade. "I'd like to say something." No one spoke. He looked over at me. "Dad." He drew a slow breath. "For years, I thought success meant providing for my family." He glanced toward his wife and son. "I forgot that my family also included the man who spent his whole life providing for me." His voice broke. "I can never take back that text message." He looked down for a moment, then brought his eyes back to mine. "But I promise you'll never have to wonder again whether someone is coming for you." Renee reached over and took my hand. "Neither will I." I looked around the table at my children, my grandchildren, and the empty chair we'd left there on purpose for Helen. Not because we thought she was still physically with us, but because love has a way of staying present even after goodbye. I smiled. "I think your mother would be happy." Colin gave a quiet laugh. "No, she'd be telling us the salmon's burning." Everyone laughed. It felt wonderful. Not because the pain had gone, but because joy had finally found enough room to settle in beside it. If you've stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, then I think you already know why it needed to be told. This is what a dad's revenge really looks like. Not anger, not bitterness, not a single word spoken in public to make his children look small. Gerald Callahan's revenge was showing up anyway, quietly, without a scoreboard, without a receipt. It cost him more than most people will ever know. And I believe God placed him at that airport for a reason that had nothing to do with the flight. The love he carried for Helen, for Colin, for Renee, that love didn't wait to be earned. It simply kept going. That is the thing, this family. Revenge Story keeps asking me, What would you do if no one was watching and no one was keeping score? Here is what I took from Gerald's life, and I hope you'll carry at least one of these with you. First, show up even when no one expects you to, especially then. Second, if your experience can spare someone else pain, it is no longer just yours to keep. Third, when someone you love finally comes back to you, that is the repayment. Let it be enough. Fourth, the quietest hearts in any room are often holding the most. If this story reached something in, you leave a comment below and tell me what it stirred up. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, a father, a son, a daughter who has let too much time go by, please pass it along. That is the whole reason I do this. Subscribe to Dad's Revenge if you haven't yet, so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here today. Take care of the people who are still within reach. I'll talk to you soon.